The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. I knew that the moment I wrapped both hands around the mug, feeling nothing but the faint ghost of warmth from whenever I'd poured it. The kitchen smelled like lemon dish soap and the faint, stale sweetness of bananas going soft in the fruit bowl nobody touched anymore. Outside, a neighbor's sprinkler ticked in slow, indifferent circles. Normal Saturday morning sounds. Normal, suburban stillness. Except for the way my wife was sitting across the breakfast table from me, spine perfectly straight, both hands folded in front of her like she was about to chair a board meeting. Sandra had always carried herself like that. Composed. Deliberate. Every word measured before it left her mouth. It was one of the things that drew me to her 16 years ago, that calm certainty she wore like a second skin. Standing in the parking lot of a conference in Denver, she'd told me exactly what she thought of the keynote speaker. Wrong on 3 counts, she'd said, and here's why. And I remember thinking, God, I want to talk to this woman for the rest of my life. Funny how the same quality that once felt like strength can look entirely different once you understand what's behind it. She cleared her throat softly, not from discomfort, more the way someone taps a microphone before a presentation. There's something I've been meaning to tell you, she said. Her voice was level, unhurried, the same voice she used when she was explaining why she'd already decided what we were doing for Thanksgiving before she'd bothered asking me. I've been seeing someone. It's been going on for about 8 months. His name is Derek. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her. She held my gaze without flinching. Derek is the regional VP. We've been working closely together since the Hartwell acquisition, and it became something more. I'm not apologizing for it. I want you to understand that. This isn't something I'm ashamed of or planning to hide. I set the mug down very carefully. She continued. I've thought about this at length, and I think the most mature path forward is honesty. Derek is going to be coming by this afternoon. I'd like you two to meet properly. She paused, as if waiting for me to catch up. I think it's important that we establish some ground rules going forward. I blinked. Going forward? For the household, she clarified. The faintest note of impatience creeping in. He'll be spending time here. I prefer we handle this like adults rather than making it uglier than it needs to be. I remember sitting very still and feeling something happen behind my sternum. Not the collapse I might have expected. Not grief, exactly. More like the sensation of a very old, very rotten floor beam finally giving way under a weight it had been straining to hold for a long time. A kind of hollow crack. Then just open air underneath. I want a divorce, I said. The composure flickered. Just once. A brief tightening around her eyes. Then it was back, smooth and sealed. She leaned forward slightly, both palms flat on the table. Marcus, think carefully about what you're saying. I'm not confused about what I'm saying. Her chin lifted. You'll want to reconsider. I've already spoken with Warren. He's prepared to move very quickly. She meant Warren Albright, the most aggressive divorce attorney in the county. A man who'd spent 30 years turning matrimonial proceedings into scorched earth campaigns. I know what this house is worth. I know what your business is worth. I have documentation of your income going back 9 years. She said it the way someone lays cards on a table, slow and deliberate, watching your face. You walk out of this marriage on bad terms, and I will take you apart piece by piece. That is not a threat. That's a professional courtesy. I'm telling you because I'd rather we don't go down that road. I looked at her for a long moment. There was something almost clinical about her expression. She wasn't angry. She was calibrating, reading the room the way she always did, deciding what pressure to apply where. What time is he coming? I asked. Her eyes narrowed slightly. 2 o'clock. I nodded once. Okay. She studied me, apparently unsatisfied with the response. She'd expected something else. Tears, maybe. Or volume. She'd always been better at quiet devastation than I was at loud anger, and I think some part of her had been looking forward to the contrast. Instead, I just stood up, rinsed my mug in the sink, and went to make some phone calls from the back porch. I want to be honest about something. I'd had 3 weeks. I'd noticed it the way you notice a change in the weather before it happens. Not the storm itself, but the particular heaviness in the air. The way sound carries differently. The way a person's eyes move when they're carrying something they haven't said yet. I'd noticed, and I'd done what I spent the better part of my adult life learning to do. which was not to react until I understood the full shape of the situation. So I'd made some calls. I'd had a quiet conversation with my accountant, a short meeting with a man named Phil Dorsey who'd been a forensic CPA before he went private, and a longer conversation with a woman named Renata, who happened to be one of the sharpest family law attorneys in the state, and who also happened to owe me a fairly significant professional favor from a construction dispute that had gotten ugly and complicated 5 years ago. By the time Sandra told me about Derek over cold coffee on a Saturday morning, I already knew considerably more about the situation than she understood. He arrived at 2:15, which told me something right away. The man who was confident in his position doesn't keep people waiting in their own home. The man who's quietly nervous shows up late. I heard Sandra open the front door, and I heard his voice before I saw him. Louder than necessary. That particular brand of volume that's less about being heard and more about filling a room before you've earned the right to fill it. I was in the living room, seated in the armchair by the window, with a glass of iced tea I wasn't drinking, and when he walked in, I took a moment to simply look at him. Derek was somewhere in his mid-40s. The kind of man who'd clearly been reasonably athletic at some point and had since surrendered most of it to business lunches and airport lounges. He was wearing a sport coat over an open-collar shirt, the collar slightly askew, and he had the particular look of someone who'd spent a lot of time being told he was impressive and had decided this constituted a personality. He was holding a bottle of wine with the label facing outward, deliberately, like a prop. Sandra touched his arm. "Derek, this is Marcus." Derek crossed the room and extended his hand with that specific handshake aggression. The kind that's more about grip pressure than greeting. He smiled at me, but it was a smile with an edge to it. The smile of a man who thinks he's already won and wants to make sure you know it. "Marcus." He said my name like it was a minor inconvenience. "Appreciate you being reasonable about all this. Sandra said you were a practical guy." He glanced around the room, taking inventory. "Nice place. Good bones." He said it the way a contractor assesses a property he's about to demo. I looked at him steadily. "Have a seat," I said. He sat on the couch, Sandra beside him, and he leaned back and crossed one ankle over his knee with the easy sprawl of a man making himself comfortable in a space he's decided belongs to him. Sandra placed one hand on his forearm. "I think we should talk about the practical arrangements," she said, directing it at me. "I'd like Derek to have access to the house on a regular basis. We can work out a schedule for you to have time here as well," she added magnanimously, like she was offering me visiting hours. Derek smiled at me over the rim of the wine glass he'd helped himself to. "Look, man," he said, "I know this is uncomfortable, but honestly, the sooner we get the details sorted out, the better for everybody. I've already talked to Warren myself, actually." He told Sandra I might have some useful input on the financial side. And honestly, the way I see it, the house, the equity, the business valuation, Sandra's entitled to a fair share of all of it. He said fair the way people say fair when they mean more than half. He was watching my face while he said it. I got the distinct impression this was a performance he'd been looking forward to. I let a moment pass. Then I said, "Derek, can I ask you something?" He spread his hands. "Shoot. What exactly do you think you're entitled to here?" He chuckled, glancing at Sandra. "I'm not entitled to anything," he said, with the tone of a man listing his assets. "This is about Sandra getting what's hers. And frankly, the way the numbers work, you're going to have some decisions to make." He tilted his head. "Sandra tells me the engineering firm is doing about $2.3 million in annual revenue." I nodded slowly. "She's right. It was." He caught the past tense. His smile didn't waver, but something shifted slightly behind his eyes. "Was. I sold it," I said. 11 days ago. Closed escrow on Thursday." Sandra's hand went still on his arm. "What?" "I sold the firm to the Counter Group. Asset sale, not stock. I consulted with my attorney and my accountant, and since the business was a sole proprietorship, I'd founded 8 years before we were married. And since I had a very clear prenuptial agreement drawn up before we signed anything in 2009, the proceeds are protected as separate property." I took a sip of my iced tea. "The prenup, I should mention, that you signed and that has been sitting in Renata Solis's office in a fireproof filing cabinet since the day we got back from our honeymoon." Sandra stared at me. "Marcus, the house," I continued calmly, "is mortgaged at about 82% of current market value. After the note is paid and closing costs factored in, the equity is modest. We split that down the middle. You'll walk away with somewhere around $40,000. That's your entitlement in community property. Derek had uncrossed his ankle from his knee. He was sitting forward now. His wine glass was on the coffee table. The pension is protected under the prenup as well. So is the investment account I've had since before we met. I had my forensic CPA pull the records on our joint accounts. He found some interesting things. Sandra, I believe you've been moving money out of our joint savings account in increments over the last 6 months. Just under $10,000 at a time, so it wouldn't trigger a bank report. Phil calculates it at around $47,000 total. Her face had gone a particular shade of pale. My attorney has already filed a motion to freeze the joint accounts and document the dissipation of marital assets. Judge Carver signed off on it yesterday. She smiled slightly when she did it, apparently. Derek was looking at Sandra now, not at me. Something was recalibrating behind his eyes. There's one more thing, I said. I looked at Derek directly. You're the regional VP at Hartwell Capital, correct? He said nothing. Hartwell Capital is publicly traded. The SEC has fairly specific rules about executives engaging in relationships with subordinates. When those relationships create conflicts of interest in deals those executives are directly overseeing. Sandra's division closed 2 major transactions in the past 8 months. The Meridian deal and the Orvet acquisition, both of which were overseen by you, and both of which Sandra's team received unusually favorable internal credit allocation for. I have a friend who works in compliance consulting. He found it interesting enough to mention to someone he knows at the regional SEC office. I paused. I didn't file anything, but I do have the documentation. I set my glass down on the coaster. I thought you should know. The room was very quiet. Derek stood up. He wasn't performing anymore. He picked up his wine glass, seemed to reconsider, set it back down. He looked at Sandra with an expression I recognized as the look of a man doing rapid arithmetic on his own exposure. He ran one hand across the back of his neck. I need to make a call, he said. He walked toward the front door, and for just a second he paused in the doorway. He looked back at me, and then he looked at the house, and I could see him reassessing everything he decided about the situation before he walked through the door. Then he stepped outside and pulled it shut behind him. Sandra sat motionless on the sofa. The wine glass he'd left was still on the table, leaving a ring on the wood. She stared at the door for a long moment, then at the floor, then finally at me. When she looked up, her eyes were different. The composure was still there, but it had changed quality, the way ice looks different once it started to fracture underneath. How long have you known? She asked. Long enough, I said. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't say anything either. There was a sound from outside, Derek's car starting, pulling out of the driveway, pulling away. She listened to it, I think. We both did. You should call Warren, I said. My attorney will be reaching out Monday morning. I'd like this to move quickly. She nodded once. Slowly, like a woman agreeing to terms she didn't have the energy to fight. She left the room without another word, the heels of her shoes clicking down the hallway toward the stairs. I heard the bedroom door close. Not a slam, just a click. I sat back in the armchair and looked out the window at the front yard, where the afternoon light was going long in gold across the grass. The next few weeks moved with the particular grinding efficiency of a legal process that neither party has the will to slow down. Sandra called Warren. Warren called Renata. Numbers were exchanged, challenged, documented. The prenup held the way. Prenups written by thorough attorneys always hold. The joint account freeze was lifted after Sandra agreed to return the $47,000 in 3 installments. The house went on the market in October. Derek, for his part, had apparently concluded during that phone call in my driveway that his interests and Sandra's interests were no longer aligned. By the time the first week was over, I'd learned through an indirect channel that he'd quietly transferred Sandra out of his oversight and submitted a voluntary disclosure to his company's internal compliance office, explaining that a personal relationship had potentially created an appearance of conflict during the Meridian and Orvet deals. He framed it as a proactive disclosure, the kind of move a responsible executive makes when he wants to protect himself before someone else makes it for him. Sandra's favorable credit allocations were reviewed, adjusted. The bonuses she'd received were flagged for re-examination. It didn't ruin her career, but it shook the foundation of everything she'd been building on. She'd tied her professional credibility to a man who, when it came down to it, was very good at protecting himself. I heard about Derek indirectly one more time a few months later from a colleague who'd overlapped with him at a conference in Chicago. Apparently, Derek had given a presentation about ethical leadership in corporate relationships, standing up there in front of 300 people, talking about integrity and professional responsibility. My colleague mentioned it over lunch, thinking it was mildly interesting. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and ate my sandwich. The house sold in December. Sandra took her half of the equity and moved into a furnished apartment near her office. I wasn't there when she packed. I'd arranged to be at a job site that day, which was deliberate. I didn't want to watch her go, not because I couldn't bear it, but because I'd already said everything I needed to say sitting in that armchair with a glass of iced tea, and anything after that felt like a scene that didn't need to be played. I moved into a smaller place on the other side of town, a rental, while I figured out what came next. It had a decent kitchen and a back patio that faced west, so you could sit outside in the evenings and watch the light change. I started cooking again. Actually cooking, not just reheating, which I hadn't done in years. I found out I was reasonably good at it. The consulting work I'd structured during the business sale kept me busy. The counter group retained me as an independent advisor during the transition period, which meant I was working on interesting problems without the weight of running everything myself. I started sleeping better within about 3 weeks, which told me things about the previous few years that I'd been too close to see clearly. Phil Dorsey, the forensic CPA, sent me a holiday card in December with a handwritten note that said, in his dry way, one of the more satisfying cases of the year. I put it on the refrigerator for a while. Renata's fee was substantial, but she sent me a very complete breakdown of the billing, and I didn't dispute a single line item. I'd gotten exactly what I paid for. I ran into Derek once. It was early spring, nearly 5 months after all of it, at the kind of upscale casual restaurant near downtown where business people have lunches that are supposed to look relaxed and aren't. I was there with a former colleague, just catching up. Derek came in with 2 other men in similar sport coats, the uniform of his particular professional class, and he was talking as he walked, which seemed to be a habit of his, filling space with words. He saw me from about 20 feet away. I watched the recognition move across his face, and then I watched the calculation happen, whether to acknowledge, whether to look away, whether to perform something. He held my gaze for exactly as long as it took him to realize none of those options worked particularly well for him. Then he looked slightly to the left of me and found something apparently interesting in the middle distance, and he kept walking toward his table. I turned back to my lunch. The food was good. The coffee was better. Outside the window, the city went about its ordinary business, indifferent and steady as it always is, and I drank my coffee and let the afternoon go in whatever direction it wanted to go. Somewhere in the weeks after Sandra left, a friend asked me how I was doing with all of it. Meaning, was I devastated? Meaning, did I feel hollowed out? Meaning, what does a man do when 16 years turns out to be what those 16 years turned out to be what those 16 years turned out to be? I thought about it for a moment before I answered. I said I was fine and it was true, but I want to be precise about what I meant by fine. I didn't mean I was untouched. I meant that somewhere around the 3rd or 4th week of knowing what I knew and saying nothing and working quietly and methodically through every piece of what needed to be done, something had settled in me. Not hardness, not the absence of feeling. Something more like clarity. The floor had given way and I hadn't fallen. I'd simply found out where the solid ground actually was. That's worth knowing. A man my father's age told me once, and I didn't really understand it at the time, that the worst thing about being deceived isn't the deception. It's the length of time you spend afterward trying to reconcile the version of events you were given with the version that was actually true, trying to decide which moments were real and which were staging. He said the best thing you can do is stop trying to reconcile them. Just accept that there are 2 parallel versions and you are only living in one of them, and then choose, deliberately, which version of what comes next is actually yours. I thought about that a lot, sitting on the back patio watching the light change. I thought about it one evening in April when I was cooking something with shallots and thyme and a dry wine I'd opened for the purpose, which is a reasonable use of a dry wine. The kitchen smelled like something warm and real, and the windows were going orange and the sprinkler ticked outside somewhere. And I stood there in my own kitchen in my own time and felt, clearly and without any ambiguity at all, that whatever came next was entirely mine to decide. I turned the heat down a little on the pan. I opened the back door to let the evening air in. Outside, the neighborhood went on being a neighborhood, steady and unremarkable, and the sky went from orange to the particular deep blue that comes just before dark. And I stood in my kitchen in the quiet and cooked my dinner and didn't know anyone in the world a single explanation for a single thing. That's what I mean when I say I was fine.